So this topic that we're covering today is research methods with JMP. We're going to cover some clustering, some factor analysis in the process, some principal components analysis, and then toward the end, some confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation models. This is not my area of expertise, and so I had to do a little bit of digging and find some cool examples to play around with this myself, and I have to say this is really fun. I'm really excited to share some of the things that I've learned. I did a few things in this general area, path analysis, structural equation modeling, when I was in graduate school 15 years ago, and it was much more difficult for me at that time. Now that's, partly that I've learned a lot in the many years since, but also what JMP has put into the newest version of the software for path diagrams and structural equation modeling is really cool and really easy to use. So I'm super excited to show you guys that. We will cover that toward the end of this, the second half. So I'm going to start with some clustering, some sort of exploration of data, move into principal components and factor analysis, and then we'll get into things that would have a path diagram associated with them, like confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling toward the end. A lot of what I'm going to show you today, you can read more about this from a book by Norma Rourke and Larry Hatcher called A Step-by-Step Approach to Using SAS for Factor Analysis and Structural Equation Modeling. This shows you how to do these things in SAS and gives you SAS code for it, but I'm using an example for the second half of this talk today that's kind of based on something that they're showing in that book. So there's a lot more information on sort of how to decide if a model fits well and the theory behind it in an applied way, but there's a lot more detail if you want to look for that in this book. So we're going to get started by exploring the data. So we'll start with this data set, this serial data set. This is from, it's a built-in data set in JMP. So if you've got JMP open, and I'm running JMP on a Mac, so you can see my JMP menu bar is along the top of my window. So if I go to the Help menu in JMP, and Sample Data Library. Here you'll find a list of lots of data sets, and so I've looked alphabetically in this list, and I've clicked on the serial.jmp data set. So this data set is available in the Sample Data Library, and you can follow along if you'd like to now or come back to it later when you're watching the video. So this data set has 76 rows in it, 76 different serials. So each row is a serial. And then a lot of information about that serial, things like the calories in one serving, the protein in one serving, the fat in one serving, and so on. So some ways that we might want to start by exploring this. In JMP 15, you now have this little sort of mini distribution platform right at the top of the data set. So I can quickly see many of the cereals are from General Mills. The next biggest group is Kellogg's, then Quaker Oats, then Post. All of this is interactive, just like the distribution platform is. So if I click on General Mills, I see the General Mills, the distribution of General Mills darker in all the other outputs. But I can see the protein content. If I wanted to select maybe the highest amounts of protein, I can see high protein cereals tend to also have higher calories. They maybe have slightly higher fat. Doesn't seem to be the outliers, but it's a little bit higher in fat, maybe middle of the road in sodium, across the board in fiber, higher in complex carbohydrates. So I can use that little mini distribution output at the top the way that I've always used distribution, or I can go to Analyze and Distribution to sort of explore these things to begin with. So I might look at the manufacturer, whether the cereal is hot or cold, some other characteristics like calories, fat, sodium, fiber, all of these things. Let's see what enriched is. Let's just look at everything. So I can click all of these guys over here and maybe just look at the histograms. And I've got a bunch of these. So here's a tip. If I want to arrange these in rows, I could put them in like 4 across. Now it's a little bit easier for me to see them all on just scrolling one page instead of down and down and down. And again, everything's interactive. So I can see that almost all the cereals are cold. There's only a few that are hot cereals. I could see my cereals that are lower calorie tend to be lower in fiber, tend to be lower in protein. So I can kind of start exploring interesting features about this. I can also start looking for outliers, either things that just are a little bit outlying in my eye. So under total carbohydrates, this guy is a little bit outlying, but I could also see if it really is an outlier. So if I wanted to look at the outlier box plot, for example, I see that according to the actual calculation of an outlier here, that point is not an outlier. So it's close enough to the typical data to not be actually a statistical outlier, even though it is kind of an outlying value. So I can explore these data univariate like this. There's also a bunch of tools for cleaning the data. So if I have missing data, I can do imputation of the data. If I have coding errors, I can find them kind of quickly with the distribution and then recode them. If you want to learn more about data cleaning, there's a lot of nice videos on our webinars page. I'll give you the link at the end for where you can find more webinars like this, and we've got some really nice things about how to clean your data. But assuming that the data are pretty clean, the next thing I would do is go to this multivariate methods. And so this is where we're going to spend most of today. We're going to look at the multivariate platform. Then a little bit later, we'll look at principal components and principal components turning into factor analysis. We'll also look at structural equation models, which is where we'll find confirmatory factor analysis and anything that we could put a path diagram with. So those are some of the things from this menu we'll look at today. And we're also going to spend a moment at the beginning in clustering, looking at hierarchical clustering of the rows and looking at how to cluster variables, because that's kind of similar to what we're doing with factor analysis. So I think it's worth noticing that today. So I'll start in multivariate methods with this platform called Multivariate. And let's take a bunch of our numeric variables so that we can actually calculate bivariate correlations. That's the goal here, is we're going to look at correlations between pairs of variables across the whole data set. So we're seeing things like calories with calories is 100% correlated, a correlation of 1. Calories with protein has a correlation of 0.7, which is still pretty high. So the high positive correlations are showing up in dark blue. The high negative correlations, like this is kind of an example, would show up in a bright red. So this is a moderate or kind of low, but somewhat sizable correlation that's negative. So negative 0.35 between fiber and the cups per serving. So this is a negative correlation, it turns red. And the things that are pretty small, like negative 0.04, or 0.10, these are pretty small. They stay a gray color. So it helps your eye to see where the positive correlations are, the negative correlations, and the things that aren't really very strong correlations. Across the diagonal, we see ones across the entire diagonal because everybody with themselves is 100% correlated. And we see that same information that's in this numeric matrix down below in a plot. So the plot below is showing us the same information. We could actually ask to put the correlations on top of this. So if I ask to show correlations, it will print those numbers in these boxes. If I grab a corner, I could make this a little bit larger, easier to see. So this is the same information. Calories to calories is 100% correlated, so we don't need to see that. But calories to protein was 0.7, as we saw in the table above. And calories to fat is 0.64. We can also see, if we wanted to show, for example, the shaded ellipse, we can see visually when we have something that's highly correlated, like 0.7, this ellipse gets tighter. So a high correlation means that there's some kind of linear trend and the points are kind of tight to that linear trend. So here we can see that with this tighter oval. Here is also a pretty tight oval. On the other hand, here's a very wide circle because this correlation is just 0.005. Really low correlation. So there's really no trend, so we don't see that sort of linear shape coming together with the ellipse. So the idea of a lot of what we're going to look at today is based on these correlations. A lot of what we're going to do with estimating structural equation models at the end, or confirmatory factor analysis, or even principal components, is going to be built on internally. First, we're looking at these correlations between different measurements, and then we're using those correlations to help us understand better what structure is behind the scenes. So another tool that I could look at here is under Graph Builder. I could look at 3D relationships. So it's easy to visualize in 2D, like calories versus protein. If I wanted to visualize something in 3D, maybe grab calories, protein, and fat, I could visualize this with a 3D scatter plot. The points are tiny, so I'm going to right click and go to Settings and choose to make the markers bigger. That's much easier for me to see. If you always find yourself making the same change in JMP, you can also go to the JMP preferences. So on Mac, that's JMP and Preferences. On Windows, it's going to be under File and Preferences. And you can make those marker settings larger permanently, but I find that usually I want the dots to be small. It's just easier to see right now. So this scatter plot, I can just sort of drag it around, and I just clicked off of it. And I can kind of get a sense about what's happening here. So let's first of all think about maybe clustering the data. So we can cluster the data. If we look back at the actual data set, we can cluster the data in two ways. We can either cluster the rows that are similar together, so we can see which cereals are similar. So do they tend to have higher calories together and higher protein and higher fat? Maybe that's one cluster. Maybe high calorie but low protein is another cluster. So we'll find kind of trends across all those variables and cluster the rows together. Or we can cluster the columns. So we can actually see which of these pieces of information seem to co-vary together. So maybe calories and protein tend to grow together. Or maybe calories and fat tend to go together. That's actually pretty likely. The more fat you have in a cereal, probably the more calories you have in that cereal. So we may be able to find clusters of some of these columns or variables that are grouping together. So we'll start with the typical way we talk about clustering, which is clustering the rows and finding segments. Segments of some of the cereals seem kind of similar. So to do this, we would go to Analyze and Clustering. This would be like a hierarchical cluster or a k-means cluster. Hierarchical cluster is a great tool when we've got a moderate sized data, so maybe up to 2,000 rows. And we're definitely in that circumstance. We have only 76 rows. So here I can actually cluster, I can use continuous things to cluster, but I can also use some of these categorical variables if I want to. So I could include hot and cold, I could include enriched, and this other fiber variable at the bottom. So I'll put those into the columns, and if I stretch this out, you can see there's all of my columns that I'm going to cluster on. We're actually going to see hot and cold because I think only 3 cereals are hot cereals. It really is not important. We may find some of these other variables are also not that important, so let's find out. So if I click OK, I see first of all this dendrogram, so it gives me the name of each row. When your data set's really large, these will get smushed down and much harder to see. So if I had 2,000 rows here, it would be much harder to see this, but you can zoom in and stretch things if you want to, or you can hover over something to see its name displayed for you. And we see this little caret. If I click on the caret, it puts a number next to it. So if I stop it right here, at this moment, there are 9 clusters. So if I stop it here, it has this cluster, this cluster, this cluster. So that's 3. So if you look at how many intersections there are, there's 1, 2, 3, and I actually moved it down to 10. Here there's 9. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. So I can decide how many clusters I want by moving up the hierarchy. So here I only have 2 clusters, 2 big clusters, this one and this one. I might want to use some of these other plots to help me discover what seems like the right number of clusters. So for example, if I look at that 3D scatter plot of calories, protein, and fat, I have one group highlighted right now. So that's the bottom cluster. So you can see that on fat, they're kind of across the spectrum, but they all have higher calories for the most part. There's a tiny little mid-calorie sub-piece of that cluster, whereas these guys tend to have lower calories. So I'm seeing calories seems to be really important in determining that piece of the split. I could group these guys farther down, and in order to see this more easily, if I set on the coloring of the clusters, now I don't have to click on these guys and select them. I can leave all the points the same size, but I can see that now I've colored by different clusters. So these red guys, just by their names, I can kind of see that this is 100% bran, bran buds, all bran with extra fiber, fiber one, bran flakes. These seem to be bran-based or really fibery cereals. So the red points might have high fiber in them. I'm not really seeing that across the calories. Let's see if I can see it in any of these other dimensions from these 3 variables. Not really strongly, so maybe they have a little bit higher or mid protein, but I'm not seeing the red guys really having to do very much with fat, protein, and calories. What about the green group? So this group, they do have low calories, they have low protein, and let's look at them on the fat scale, and they have low fat. So another way that I can look at this really easily is from this red triangle. If I choose the parallel coordinates plot, this is a really nice way to see. So right now I have 6 clusters chosen. I see that each line is one observation, one serial. So this line here is the all-bran serial. So all-bran has super high potassium, but all-bran has maybe medium on this enriched variable. It has kind of medium on weight per serving, kind of medium on cups per serving compared to at least the rest of its members in its group, but kind of low in general, and pretty high on this last fiber variable. This guy also really high on fiber, low on fat. So I can watch the trend across all of our variables for each individual serial and for the trends in general for the different clusters. So to identify my 6 different clusters here, I can see that maybe cluster 6 is low fat and low sodium, but high on complex carbohydrates and total carbohydrates, low on sugar. So this is low on fat, sodium, and sugar, but high on complex carbohydrates. So this is things like shredded wheat and bran, shredded wheat spoon size, shredded wheat tubus. So this is lots of and frosted mini wheat. So these are all the shredded wheat types of cereals. These guys seem to be high on the carbohydrates, low on the calories from fat, and really low on fat. And this is things like Quaker Oat squares, Almond Crunch with raisins. So again, we can use this clustering to figure out which rows are similar. We're going to spend the rest of this session really talking more about how to find what's in common between our variables instead of segmenting our rows and finding out sort of like segments within our data set. We're going to instead be focusing more on clustering in the other direction. So let's pivot and look at a cluster for the columns instead. So I'll close a few of these things that we don't need as much. And we'll go back to the clustering, so analyze clustering, and now at the very bottom there's an option called cluster variables. So this is going to be a little bit more similar to doing a factor analysis or a principal components analysis. The idea here is that we're going to take a bunch of numeric features, and not this guy, there we go. So a bunch of numeric features about these guys, and we're going to see what variables are highly correlated with each other. So we already kind of saw that in the original correlations output, but we can see that if I hover my mouse over any of these, it'll tell me which it is. So the first is the calories. They're going in order. So first is calories, the second one is protein, the third one is complex carbohydrates, the fourth one is total carbohydrates, the fifth one is weight per serving. I can always grab a corner and stretch this out if that makes it easier to see. But these first 5 variables, they seem to be very highly correlated. Then we get a tiny little cluster of these 2 being highly correlated. What are these? This is fiber and potassium. So fiber and potassium are highly correlated. This guy's kind of on his own. That's cups per serving. And then fat and sugars and calories from fat are highly correlated. And then this guy's kind of on his own, sodium. So what we see is a summary of the first, if we were to cluster this, and for example, cluster this into 4 clusters, the first cluster would have 5 members. That would be this big chunk of 5 at the top. The most representative variable in that is the weight per serving. So weight per serving actually explains better what's in all of those other variables. So if we had to pick one representative variable from this whole chunk, that's the best one. We're able to explain 82.7% of the variation in the clusters, of the cluster variation with this cluster. And then the next cluster 2 has 3 and fiber 3 members, and fiber is the most representative. Cluster 3 has 3 members, and calories from fat is the most representative. And then sodium just has the 1 member, so it's able to explain all of its own variation. But it really doesn't explain that much extra variation. So here again, we see who gets to belong to each cluster. Now, in a second, when we go into principal components analysis, we're not going to have these distinct group memberships anymore. So this clustering the variables allows us to use their correlations with each other to figure out which columns are similar to each other and could be grouped together. When we go into PCA, principal components analysis, or exploratory factor analysis, we're going to get an idea of these, like maybe some of these variables more closely match up with cluster 1, but we're not going to actually fully separate them anymore. We're going to use the math of their correlations and let each variable essentially load onto, that's the language that we would use in factor analysis, we'll let each variable load onto any of the factors, so any of the clusters, so they will no longer be distinct. So just keep that in mind, and hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about as we go through that. So the next thing we'd want to go to is, I'm in the wrong place here. There we go, under Analyze, under multivariate methods. So we've looked at just bivariate correlations. We looked at hierarchical clustering for the rows, and then clustering variables for something more similar to PCA that we'll look at in a moment. Now if we go back into multivariate methods and we go to PCA, principal components analysis, this is where we're going to begin using those correlations to identify components that are in there that we can sort of reduce. Instead of having 10 variables, we might be able to just describe 2 or 3 variables that still encapsulate all the information that was in the original 10 variables. Principal components and factor analysis are very similar, and factor analysis you can launch here by itself, or you can start with the principal components and then launch it through the results from principal components. So for principal components, we would take those continuous variables again, so everybody but this one, and say OK. And this is showing us these eigenvalues are part of a decision criteria to see how many important components are there. In this case, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 eigenvalues. That's going to match up with the fact that we have 11 variables. So there should be 11 distinct variables that are showing up in our map. There, if I go back to our window, so relaunch analysis, there are 11 components that I've included, which means that we can rearrange the information in them in any way that we want to, up to 11 different components. So we can take the original 11 components and make them equations related to each other and make 11 new components. That's what principal components has done. And the idea is it took, let's look back at under the 3D scatter plot. The idea is it takes some kind of a 3D, or in our case 11D. So if we could plot this with all 11 dimensions, we've got an 11-dimension situation, and and this is an example of a 3-dimension situation, and we essentially try to find the direction, like how could we tilt this so that we find the spread as long as possible. So this is a lot of variation from this corner up to this corner. So I essentially am standing on one side of my data, my 11-dimensional data set, with a flashlight, and I'm shining that flashlight and I'm trying to pull out one dimension on the wall that describes a huge amount of the variation. So that's what principal components is doing. So it's going to say, well, this is maybe your first principal axis, and then it'll tilt it orthogonally to that, so at a right angle, and say this is your next principal axis. So after you've described this huge amount of variation, then you can describe this amount of variation in this direction. So that's what's happening here. The first component is always going to be the biggest eigenvalue. It explains a lot of the variation. There were 11 components, and if each variable got to describe its own variance, then its eigenvalue would be 1. So when we see an eigenvalue larger than 1, that tells us that this component is explaining more than the variance in just one component, one variable. It's explaining lots more. So smushing this down to just one dimension that explains essentially almost 5.5 variables worth of information is really cool. Instead of using 5 distinct variables, we could use this one new component that summarizes all the information that was in 5 distinct variables, is essentially what this is telling us. So an eigenvalue above 1, everything that we see above here, every eigenvalue above 1 is a component that includes more information than just one unique variable from our original 11. So one of the ways to sort of guess at how many components we want is to look at these eigenvalues and to say, okay, 5.6, 2.0, and 1.8 are all above 1, so I want 3 components. Another way of looking at this is something called a scree plot. So we can ask for the scree plot here. It's telling us exactly the same information as the eigenvalue. It's plotting the eigenvalues. So again, we could look at a cutoff of 1 as one rule of thumb about this, but the other option is that we can look at where there's essentially an elbow in this plot. So when we see an elbow, the point before the elbow is probably the number of components we want. So in this case, the elbow test might tell us we just need the first 2 components, because this next one doesn't add a lot more information than we already had at this point. On the other hand, we get another little elbow here, so maybe the 3 components is the right choice. So we could choose 2 components here or 3 components. And what we're seeing here in this component plot is for the first component, which explains 46.7% of the variation in the data, most of our variables seem to have positive values on that component. So calories is very high on component 1, protein is very high on component 1. This guy, sugar, is not very high on component 1. And cups per serving is basically 0 on component 1. Sodium is also pretty low on component 1. But cups per serving and sodium are higher on component 2. So that's how we read this. And we could switch out which components we want to look at if we want to see this in different dimensions. Okay, so the idea here was we're reducing lots of information from lots of variables, like 11 variables, down to something with fewer variables, like just maybe 1 or 2 or 3 components. When we've decided how many components we want, we could save them. So we could say save columns, save principal components. We could also ask to publish the formula. If I choose the first 2 components and save the formula, I can look, for example, at the SAS code of this. Here's how it's calculating those principal components. The first one, it starts with like a intercept essentially, and then a slope times the calories, and a slope times calories from fat, and a slope times complex carbohydrates. So there's a slope or an effect coming from every one of our original variables, and that principal component is just a linear combination of all of these pieces from the other original variables. So in some ways, principal components doesn't do a lot for you because you still have to collect all 11 variables. You just get to put them into an equation and transform them into these new components called principal component 1 and principal component 2. Principal components can be useful for this dimension reduction, but a lot of times people are using it as a stepping stone on the way to a factor analysis. So I'm going to close this data set and we're going to move into another data set, which is more the type of data that you'd have when you're trying to do a factor analysis. So if you have a factor analysis scenario, you are probably trying to create maybe survey questions that are measuring a construct, a factor, and you're trying to discover that factor. So more often people who are doing factor analysis or path analysis or confirmatory factor analysis or structural equation modeling, more often they're doing this on data that's a survey type of data, maybe something measured on a Likert scale, like 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. How much do you agree with this statement? So we looked at a little bit of exploration with distribution and the multivariate platform. We looked at some clustering the rows with hierarchical clustering, clustering the columns in distinct groups with cluster columns. We looked briefly at principal components analysis. We're going to now bring principal components analysis into factor analysis, looking at this example. So this is the idea of something where you think there might be factors. You would be able to draw an idea like this in a picture like this, a path diagram like this, where you'd have different measured variables. So x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, x6. So like protein, sugar, calories from fat. We think that these things that we can measure are actually representative of some other unmeasurable construct. So something that we call a latent factor is hiding in the background. There's no way for us to directly measure it. So this could be like intelligence. When you get an IQ score on an IQ test, that's trying to measure your true intelligence, but we know we can't directly measure your actual intelligence. So your intelligence is a latent construct hiding in the background, and we are able to measure different aspects of that. So we draw these pictures where we have like a latent variable like this. The latent variables get put in circles. The things we can measure get put in boxes. And we get these arrows, and the arrows, this is why we call it a path diagram, because we show these paths in these diagrams. The arrows are saying that the latent construct, like latent construct A, or maybe intelligence, is hiding in the background and it's influencing your answers on your IQ tests or your different pieces of your IQ test. So that's why we draw these directional arrows from the latent construct to the measured variable. So the example we're going to look at for the rest of this webinar is an example about why people want to stay or leave their romantic relationships. This is an old model. This has been around since the 1980s, I believe, and people have used this to model romantic relationships, work relationships, all kinds of things. So there's actual theory behind this, and that's what you would typically want if you're really doing a true factor analysis. If you'd be maybe confirming some theory that already exists, and then maybe developing some new ideas with a structural equation model. So we have two latent variables in our data set. One of them is the idea of how much you're investing in the relationship. And our three measured variables that are trying to get at that idea are three questions on a survey. So the first question is, I have invested a lot of time and effort in developing my relationship with my current partner. And then you answer from 1 to 7 how much you feel that that's true. So if I've invested a lot of time and effort in developing my relationship with my current partner, I give it a 7. If it's not really true, I give it a 1. The second question is, my current partner and I have developed interest in lots of activities that I'd lose if our relationship were to end. So I've invested in all these activities together. And so 1 to 7, how do I feel about that statement? And then the third question about investments is, my current partner and I have developed a lot of mutual friends that I would lose if our relationship were to end. So these are all questions that are trying to get at a general feeling of how much have you got invested and at stake in your relationship. The next set of questions are trying to get at a different latent variable or a different latent construct. So the next three questions are about, do you feel like in your romantic relationship you have other options? You don't have to stay with that person. So question number 4, it would be more attractive for me to be involved in a relationship with someone else rather than to continue a relationship with my current partner. So if you are thinking about how it would be really nice to be with somebody different, you might answer a 7. If that's not really an issue for you, you would answer a 1, or somewhere in between. The next question, question 5, it would be more attractive for me to be by myself than to continue my relationship with my current partner. And question 6, in general, the alternatives to this relationship are quite attractive. So this is how we would draw out the path diagram. We'd have our 6 measured variables, and we would say there's 2 latent constructs in the background, sort of feeding into these 3 things. So as we explore this with a factor analysis, an exploratory factor analysis would first be looking at, are there any factors? A confirmatory factor analysis will be looking at, okay, I really think this is a factor that goes with these 3 guys, and this is a factor that goes with these 3 guys. Let me test if that seems true or not. So exploratory factor analysis, we don't really have quite as much theory developed yet. We're really kind of exploring our questions to see if factors emerge. Confirmatory factor analysis, we know what we want our path diagram to look at like, and we're trying to test that. So let's open this data set. This data set will be posted with this recording on our webinars location on the web, so jump.com/webinar. This will be listed there along with this recording. And this data set is made up data. So I used theory and I built a data set that kind of matches what should happen in the theory, but this is not real data. So there are 150 observations. So hypothetical people, 150 hypothetical people answering this survey. And we've actually got more than just the investments and alternatives. We have also questions about how the rewards you feel like you get from your relationship, the costs you feel like you have to pay in order to have that relationship, how satisfied you are with your relationship, and then 4 questions on how committed you feel in your relationship. So the commitment is kind of the end. Sort of if we have a response here, it's going to be sort of the commitment. So let's go back and look at this data set, starting with, let's look at the distributions first. We can do that at the top. Typically, we're expecting these variables, so they're all on a 1 to 7 scale. We're typically expecting them to be approximately normally distributed. And when they aren't, like satisfaction 2, that can be a problem. So we want to kind of check for at least something that looks a little bit uniform. This is a little more concerning with this tail. So we might want to pay close attention to how this affects our model. But in general, these don't look terrible. Then the next thing we could do is to go to multivariate methods and multivariate. And we could take all of our measurements. So I've got a couple extra variables in this data set that are the sum of, so the 3 investment, the 3 alternatives, the 3 rewards are invest sum, alternative sum, etc. So we could explore the data as sums instead, but I'll just use the original items. And here you can see really clearly that we've got these little clusters. So the investment items all seem to cluster with high correlations with each other. So that's very interesting and good. That matches our idea. We think there's a latent construct in the background that influences all 3 of these. So probably they're related to each other. Then we see the same thing with the alternatives, a little cluster of bright blue. Then we see the same with the rewards, a cluster of bright blue. But we also see a weird little cluster of rewards related to satisfaction. So that's interesting. Satisfaction and rewards might actually be measuring sort of the same thing. Then we see a cluster of cost. We also see that cost has lots of negative relationships. So it's negative with pretty much everything except for the first 2, investment and alternatives. That's because the higher you are on costs, kind of the lower you tend to be on some of the other questions. So that's a negative correlation. And then satisfaction, again, we see with itself high cluster here, but we also see that relationship between satisfaction and rewards. And then for commitment, we see a pretty high cluster among itself, but maybe a little bit more also here with satisfaction. So commitment and satisfaction also seem pretty highly related. The scatter plot matrix is a little less interesting here because we've just got 1 through 7 on each axis, but that's why if we put that density ellipse on, or the shaded ellipse, it still shows us the information really easily. So we see these clusters. Investment has these tight ellipses between investment to investment questions. So we see this high correlation here. We see high correlation rewards to rewards and so on. So after we've done that little bit of exploration, then we might want to go and actually do a principal components analysis. So I choose principal components. I choose all of my questions. And here I see that it looks like 1, 2, 3 really big components that are very important, and 4, 5. So possibly 5 latent constructs, which is interesting because I actually think there should be 6. I had 6 categories of questions. So it looks like the data is really telling me 5 components seems most interesting. If we fit these and I ask for, let's look for save columns and publish components formula again. Let's save the top 5. And let's look at that SAS code again. It's an easy one to read. So you can see that each principal component is a linear combination of these slopes or weights that are assigned to each of the questions. So every question shows up for every principal component. So this is unlike when we cluster by the factors. So if we went back to analyze cluster variables and we did the cluster of these guys, clustering these guys is going to just put 6 of the variables into one cluster. So that's probably all the satisfaction and the rewards questions. It's going to put just the 4 commitment questions into another cluster by itself, just the investment questions, just the cost questions, just the alternative questions. So this is distinct different groupings, whereas principal components is weighting every question onto each principal component. So as we move from principal components into an exploratory factor analysis, we still have that same weakness. We're getting the weights from all the questions applied to all the factors. So let's ask for that next. Let's look for, let's look first at the loading plot. Let's look for 5 components. Now we see, so again, the axis is down here for component 4. So the farther out it is on the right or the left, the higher the score is on that component 4. So investment 2 and cost 1 and alternatives 2, they seem to be kind of high on component 4. Alternative 1 and rewards, alternative 2, these guys are really low on component 2. So we can kind of explore this. We can also use that let's use the loading matrix or the formatted loading matrix, either of these guys, as another way to see visually where these original questions seem to be loading. So the questions, we believe that, for example, the 3 investment questions, so these guys, we think that those are probably one factor. And we see some nice confirmation. They seem to load really highly onto the second factor, the second principal component, although they also load kind of highly onto the fifth one. So these values here are correlations. And so we can see that the investment questions are highly correlated with principal component 2, but they're also kind of moderately correlated with principal component 5. This is not a great thing. We really want to choose the number of principal components so that we don't have this complicated relationship. It's so much easier to explain these if, as in the example of these satisfaction questions, they load really highly only on principal component 1, not on any of the others. So that helps me to believe that principal component 1 is largely about the satisfaction, although other things are loading on it as well. We can dim out those other things to make this even easier to see, and we can suppress maybe even higher loadings so that it's easier and easier to see where the really strong loadings go. So principal component 1 seems to be mostly made of satisfaction, rewards, and commitment questions, and a little bit the opposite of the costs. So then we want to take this into an exploratory factor analysis. So the next way to do factor analysis is right here from principal components, or to go back to analyze and multivariate and go straight into a factor analysis to begin with. So we can either go through principal components to get to it or start right at factor analysis. So if I do this, I get to a factor analysis. Principal components would have used this method. We already did that. We don't need to do it again. We're going to use the maximum likelihood method because that's what we really want to do for the factor analysis. And then principal components will use the diagonals of 1. I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. The factor analysis is going to try to figure out these components based only on the amount of information that's described in that variable from all the other variables in the model as well. The varimax rotation is pretty common. Let me actually ask for 5 factors, and we'll say OK. And so then we see these rotated factor loadings. So now we see that the first factor is mostly rewards and satisfaction. The second factor is mostly costs, a little bit the opposite of satisfaction. The third factor is the commitment. The fourth factor is investment. The fifth factor is the alternatives. So this is just an exploration tool. At some point, we actually want to test a theory. So when we've got new data, we might do these principal components and exploratory factor analysis to discover what kinds of correlations there are between things and where we might get a certain number of factors and what those factors sort of are. Then we want to move into confirmatory factor analysis. So before we do that, how is the factor analysis different than the principal components analysis? For factor analysis, you're thinking about these latent constructs and you're figuring out how many of them there might be, and you're believing that they are influencing your measured variables. For principal components, you're just looking at the correlations between your original variables and your outcome components. So in the idea of factor analysis, there's a little bit of an extra thing about measurement error. So we think that there's a latent construct, the factor, and then that's pushing people to make certain answers on X1 and X2. But in addition, there's a little extra variability because people don't always do exactly what the construct. There's some extra variability that happens. That's the measurement error. And so principal components has nothing to do with measurement error, but you can actually think a little bit about measurement error for factor analysis. And the idea of that, choosing to use the correlations of one versus the other version of the correlations for factor analysis, that's the idea that your variable, if you described all of its variance as just a total amount of 1, so you said every variable has just unit variance, part of that variability would be explained by all the other factors. So if we took rewards 1, if we took this variable, and we built a regression using all the other variables. So we use rewards 2, 3, costs 1, 2, 3, all the other variables as predictors. We make a regression. We'd get an R squared from that model. And that R squared, say it's 0.82. That's now how much we use to describe the diagonals of this matrix. So there's a slight difference in the calculation that has to do with that measurement error. Factor analysis is allowing measurement error. PCA is just a mathematical technique about correlations. Now, how is confirmatory factor analysis different than exploratory factor analysis? This is the idea that when we do an exploratory factor analysis like we just looked at, every variable is getting fed onto all of the factors. So even if some of the variables, so x1 and x2 and x3 are mostly about investment, but we still put a small component back on the alternatives. And x4 and x5 and x6 are mostly about the alternatives, but we still put a little component back on investment. So we don't fully separate these guys in exploratory factor analysis. In confirmatory factor analysis, we do fully separate them. We actually say, I only want x1, x2, and x3 to be associated with this factor. And I only want x4, x5, and x6 to be associated with this factor. In this way, confirmatory factor analysis is a little bit like clustering the variables, totally separable. So let's look now at the structural equation modeling platform for how we could fit these other types of like confirmatory measurement models, latent growth curves, other kinds of structural equation models. So that's all going to be under multivariate methods, structural equation models. So you've got a structural equation model when you want a confirmatory factor analysis. So factor analysis here is just exploratory. It's taking principal components and then rotating it and using that different correlation inside of it. But confirmatory factor analysis is here in structural equation models. So again, we'll grab all the measured variables. And I am showing you this in version 15.2 of JMP Pro. The structural equation models are not available in standard JMP. They are only in JMP Pro, and they first came in JMP 15. So if you have JMP Pro 15.0, the first release of JMP 15, you'll have something that looks very similar to this, but some of what I show you won't be available. If you have 15.1, you'll have most of what I'm showing you, but there's a couple cool things that are coming in 15.2, which will be released in a month or two. So it's April 2020 right now, and probably early June of 2020 is when 15.2 will come out. Most of what I'm showing you is available in 15.0, but some of the prettier things were added in these newer releases. Okay, so we start with this diagram that's not very interesting. It just puts a variable for each of our measured variables, and it puts a little variance. These little curvy things with arrows that point back at each other, any of the curvy lines have to do with variances or covariances. Straight lines will have to do with regression equations, the idea of one thing directly predicting another one instead of just co-varying with it. So one thing that we could do is I could select three things here, and I can right-click, and I can say add latent. So when I do this, I ask for the latent variable that's associated with those three guys, and that's going to be investment, and say OK. So now it moved them down here. It's got this investment variable. If I hover over it, it'll say that's what's hiding there, investment. And it has these three measured variables that are so there's a latent construct in the background that's influencing how people are choosing to respond to the three questions. So in 15.2, I can just select the questions here and add latent. If you're in a version before that, you can do that by selecting them over here. So we've already got the investment one, so let's choose the alternatives. If I scroll down a little bit, I can see that there's a place to add a latent variable here. So I can type in alternatives and add that latent variable. Then I can do the same for rewards. Add that latent variable. The same for costs. Add that latent variable. And you can see as I'm doing this, it keeps updating this plot. I'm going to make my fonts, everything a little bit smaller so we can see this better. Okay, we've got investment, alternatives, rewards, costs. I need satisfaction. And I need commitment. So if I drag this down a little bit, you can see. So I have a constant. I have all my measured variables. These are called manifest variables. I have all my latent variables in both of these lists. So now I can start drawing arrows between things to describe paths that I'm interested in. So the first thing I might want to do is a confirmatory factor analysis. I believe that these measured variables make up or are representing these latent constructs in the background, and I want to test that. So I've mostly got that built. The one extra thing I would do for a confirmatory factor analysis is I would put in, for all of my latent constructs, I would put in these covariances. So I believe that also there's co-varying between investment and alternatives and investment and rewards. So this is the confirmatory factor analysis model. All of my what are called exogenous variables, all of my variables that don't get acted upon in my model, so that's the latent constructs, they all need to co-vary with each other. There is a little lists tab here as well that shows all these things. So it shows me I'm going to estimate means for all of my variables. I'm going to estimate loadings for each of my variable questions back onto the latent construct. I'm going to estimate variances for each one of my measured variables and for each one of my latent variables. And then I'll do these covariances for all of the latent variables to each other. So this is the model I want, and I could give it a name, like I could call it confirmatory factor analysis. And then way over on the side, there is a run button. So I click the run button, and then I see, so this is kind of messy the way that it looks right now. I can right click over something and say select this latent group, and I can move it to try to make this look the way I want. Some of the features you'll see, these features are 15.2, these dashed lines. The dashed line shows up when you've got a non-significant effect. So it prints the size of the effect, negative 0.314 here on this covariance between these two variables, but it's a dashed line indicating that wasn't statistically significant. There is a statistically significant covariance between, what is this, investment and alternatives of negative 0.42 here. It would be a darker line if it was a larger effect. So I can right click on this and customize this, for example, if I want to change these. So here's where the selector is for having dashed lines for non-significant p-values. So there, I can ask it to clean this up and not show everything if I want it to. So I could, for example, not show other aspects of this diagram. Just say okay for this. And then the actual testing stuff happens here too. So let me make this a little bit bigger for us to look at this output. So the CFA model is the model we just ran. And some things we'd want to check here are the CFI. Ideally, we want this maybe 0.94 and higher. So it's not great, but it's borderline okay. The RMSEA, we'd love to see this more around 0.05, but anything below about 0.09, something around this is again kind of borderline okay. And we'd love to see this confidence band stay below about 0.09. It's pretty close, so again, it's kind of borderline. So this is a borderline acceptable model. The two models it runs before, the unrestricted and the independence model, are the unrestricted is sort of the best case scenario. So we're trying to get as close to that number as possible. The independence is kind of the worst case scenario, so we're trying to get as far away from that as possible. So our negative 2 log likelihood of 8,037 is pretty close to 7,725, and it's pretty far from 10,468. So we're in the right direction. That's why these numbers end up looking good, is we're closer to that unrestricted. So what we're looking for here are those loadings. So investment 1 question, investment 2, investment 3. Here's where we get some estimates on the loadings and p-values associated with those. So we can see that these guys seem to, in fact, be loading correctly with that latent variable. So everything is statistically significant here. Everything is statistically significant here for the variances. And down here with the covariances, some of them are not statistically significant, but we need to include them in the model. We're not so concerned about them being true. So what we're really interested here for a measurement model is this section here with the loadings. And we've got all significant loadings, so none of our questions seem like they aren't fitting well. Okay, the next type of model we might want to run is an actual structured path diagram where we have a theory in mind. So I'm going to run this from this SEM, what I've already run before. This is the model that I'm trying to run. So the alternatives and the investment, I believe that they directly impact commitment. So this is a standard idea of this model. There's a theory behind this, and so I think that the alternatives, if you feel like you've got a lot of options, you might not feel very committed. So this is probably a negative effect. Investment, if you feel very invested in your relationship, you're probably more likely to feel committed. Then the costs and rewards. The costs and rewards might be more likely related to each other. So costs might, actually, let me show you a different model. This was a simplified one. Let me show you the theoretical model. So I'll go to this and I'll ask to recall and model specification. Let's look at this path diagram. That's tidier. So this is the model I'm fitting. So investment directly impacting commitment, and we can see once we run the model, it's a non-significant effect. So investment doesn't seem to be really affecting commitment in this case. Alternatives, also, it's a negative effect, but not significant. So having other alternatives is a negative relationship, but doesn't seem to be highly significant here in the presence of the rest of the model. The costs are... Nope, still the wrong model. I'm still showing you the wrong model. Let me expand this one. Yeah, okay, so here we go. Let me maybe move something a little bit. Now this is okay. So we've got a relationship between investment and commitment that is non-significant. We have a relationship between alternatives and commitment, which is negative but non-significant. And then the costs and rewards, we have the belief that each of these, let me grab this, select this latent group and move it down a little bit so we can see the number. So this is a negative number and it's statistically significant. It's not a dotted line. So the higher the costs, the lower, lower your satisfaction. That makes sense. It took me a second there. So the higher the costs, if you feel like there's a lot of costs to keeping your relationship up, then you're going to have lower satisfaction, and that's statistically significant. The rewards, the higher the rewards, statistically significant positive effect on satisfaction. So the more rewarded you feel by your relationship, the more satisfied you are. And then satisfaction also directly impacts commitment. So here we have a mediating effect. Satisfaction is mediating the effect of costs and rewards onto commitment. So here again, when we look at the output, what we really want to check is for those statistically significant relationships, and the regressions are often the most interesting thing. So here's where we see that investment directly to commitment, non-significant. Alternatives directly to commitment, non-significant. But the other three, rewards and costs to satisfaction, those were significant, and satisfaction to commitment was significant. So that's the idea of this platform. I have run several models here so that I could compare the actual original theoretical model with several other models. Model 2 and 3 are actually just the unrestricted and independence models run again. Model 4 is, I see that there's a high relationship between the rewards and satisfaction. So I actually combined them into one latent variable in Model 4. So when I combine them into one latent variable in Model 4, you can see that the fit is actually slightly, so whether I look at the log likelihood or the corrected AIC or the BIC, any of those, I'll see the same trend that the theoretical model of 8,039 here, I get a little bit worse. So smaller is better for all of these fit statistics. So my Model 4, where I combine rewards and satisfaction into one latent variable, was actually worse fitting. Okay, so we've reached the end of the hour. I covered a lot of material here. If you want to see some more resources on these topics, that book that I gave you the reference to is a great place to go. And also there are two more really nice examples that are described in our help. One of them is in the sample data library called Job Satisfaction. One of them is in the sample data library called Political Democracy. These are two other good examples for you to play with or use in your course if you're teaching. If you go directly to our help, so this link is in the slides as well, which are posted on our webinar page for you to download, so you'll have access to all of these links. But our help will give you examples about all of this. So if you go to our help, I'll pull that up here, our help will look like this for the multivariate techniques, and so you can scroll down, and if you're interested in structural equation models or principal components or factor analysis, you'll find these examples listed there. And then I'm also including in the slides some really nice blogs. The developer of this platform in JMP for JMP 15 is Laura Castro-Shiloh, and she's written a number of really nice blogs. I love this one, Structural Equation Models, a favorite among those who use them. This blog, super nice if you're teaching. It kind of boils down these basics of what are we really doing. We're really setting up a bunch of simultaneous regression equations that we could represent in a path diagram. So how do we build those? What do those mean? What are you actually doing in the background? What's happening with these correlations and these correlation matrices? And then why would you use structural equation models versus not using them? So this is a really nice blog as well. So if you want to download these materials, they will be available at jmp.com/webinar. There will be a topic here, Research Methods with JMP, Clustering, Factor Analysis, and SEM. And when you click on that link, you'll find this video recording posted, and you'll also find the slides and the data set posted there as well. So we've gone over time, but if anyone wants to stay on and ask a question, you are welcome to do that. Chuck, has anyone posted anything in the chat or Q&A?
Yeah, there were a couple of quick questions, and let me just mention as we get ready to dive into them, if we can't answer them all, is there a good email address or place that folks can send a question into?
So if we don't get to your question, feel free to shoot me an email here, or if you need to jump off now and can't get a chance to ask.
Thanks. So one or two of the questions. So in the last structural equation modeling demo you were doing, somebody mentioned that the graph looked messy, and was curious if there was an automatic way to structure the graph.
There are a number of really nice tools. I have not gotten super adept at them yet, but you'll see that there are, for example, these tools on the side to restructure things. So like if I select this latent group here, I should be able in the diagram to, I think it's locked. That's why it's not letting me. So I'll unlock it. So if I select this latent group, I have options here to quickly sort of reorder. So I can put those guys to the side, to the top, to the other side, to the bottom. So I can make this look more like I want it to look. So very commonly with SEM models, you'll have either these guys on the top or on this side, and then you'll kind of line them all up. So any of these, I can use these tools to quickly rotate and move them around. I can also, grab this and drag it around and put it where I want. When I like the way it looks, then I hit the lock button. This is available in 15.2 because otherwise when I add new paths, it will restructure it by default for me. So there's a lot of tools to make this look the way that you want it to look. You can also right click and ask to customize this, and you can turn off some of those things. So maybe you don't want to show all of the variances and covariances. If I don't show the variances, that will make it look a little bit tidier. So you can see when I turn those off, then I don't have some of that information. So yeah, there are a lot of tools for this. I'm sorry I didn't show that super well. I'm kind of new to playing with this. Again, 15.2, which has a lot of those tools built in that make it easier to make it look the way you want it to look. That they will be available when 15.2 comes out in probably June 2020.
Great. Thanks for another one. So in SEM, is the user supposed to know the relationships between measured variables and latent variables? SEM is just to confirm the relationships are already revealed in PCA and FA?
Yes, you would not want to use a structural equation model if you don't have a theory that you're testing. You don't actually have to have latent variables. You can use the structural equation model platform. This platform does not have to have these guys. So I could actually, if I reset this, I could run this model where I just have individual variables and I'm just estimating their means and I'm estimating their variances. This model is actually one of those, that's the independence model, I think. So you do not have to have latent variables. However, if you're going to put factors with latent variables in, then yeah, you should have a theory about it at the stage that you're looking at a structural equation model. That's actually something that's covered in that blog. Let me go back one. So when to use SEM, when you don't use SEM, so you should not use it when you don't have a theory that tells you what those latent constructs should be that you're actually testing. Key reasons to use it if you have latent variables or if you have measurement error that you're trying to assess. Models where you've got variables that are both predictors and outcomes, so you can write those paths to be recursive. You can have them, investment could affect satisfaction, which then affects commitment. So you can have arrows going from one, and satisfaction works both as a predictor and as an outcome. But yeah, you absolutely should have a theory that you're testing and some kind of an idea when you're using structural equation models.
Awesome. Thanks, Ruth. And if anybody has additional questions, they can certainly email Ruth or the academic@jmp.com.
Yep, either of those email addresses is great if you've got a question about how to use this or you need to see more examples. Or if you're trying to get a license, then certainly send us an email.
Awesome. Ruth, thanks a bunch. A lot of good feedback. We certainly appreciate it.
Yep, thank you so much for hosting, and thanks for everybody who was on today.
Awesome. Hope everybody has a great day.